Oh, hey.
There you go.
Hi, Brad.
Hi, dinner.
Hi, Monica.
Just starting to think about the ice and snow coming.
It's coming. It's just 1 degree or another, either bad or worse. It's coming. Another 2 degrees.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I don't mind. But the ice could be, dangerous, as far as outages go. No fun.
That's not as if I'm doing much driving, so.
I'm not either, but I mean, look at your driveway and you're off the things that I'm sure you'll take care of. And we had a follow-up visit to do this Thursday with the vet, which I doubt that that's gonna, I confirmed it yesterday, I sent an email to confirm it. But that's pretty much up in the air, we'll see what happens. Not too far away, but it's a good idea.
Yeah, everybody, sorry about that. Okie dokie, let's get started. So before I share the doc and we go through tonight's topic, so I just want to kind of get us back to where we've been and where we're up to. So thus far in the course of the last two classes, we've established two, I guess three really points. The first is the complication of determining when produce becomes perosh shvius. The challenge being that you have different time frames for different types of products. As we saw, when you have vegetables, they follow lakita, they follow when the vegetables are harvested. That's when they get a name, is this a Shmitta product or not? As opposed to fruit, which last class we talked about that it follows chanata. It follows when the bud falls off of the branch and the fruit begins to develop, or some, like the Rambam, seem to interpret the language of basar chanata as hava shlish, that it's really the growth third. So you have basically two different possibilities for most fruit. Then, in the context of legumes and grains and other things, we saw 2 shirim ago briefly that those follow havashlish, the actual, right, a third of their growth. And then you have exceptions to the rules, right? Things like etrog, which is a fruit, but exactly how it works is a little bit up for discussion. That was all conversation one, trying to highlight why keeping track of what Shmitta, when Shmitta is, it's a lot. The second piece that we talked about was, and this was kind of the very first thing that we talked about, was that peros shvius are not supposed to really be exported. They're not supposed to leave Israel, so much so that it perhaps we're supposed to bring them back if we find, right, I think I mentioned the story of Rav Shechter 2 classes ago, that if you found wine that had kedusha shvius, he would encourage you to bring it back to Eretz Yisrael, which is not so simple. So that's another piece of us finding these things in the grocery store, and what do we do with that? The last topic, which we touched upon a little bit 2 classes ago, was non-food items, right? This is the conversation about lulav and how those things don't seem to have, right, the application of Shmita, even though the conversation about lulav was a little bit confusing, and we talked a little bit, I did a poor job, I think, explaining the end of that Gemara. But the point is that, right, if things are not really food, they generally are not going to be included in the whole conversation of Shemitah. It doesn't mean you can work the land, but still, they're not going to be included in Peros Shvius. Those were kind of the three overall points that we've been discussing thus far. Tonight, and I have to decide whether we're going to continue on the Shemitah topic for now, or again, we dabble in Shemitah and then jump away from it, because it's really a beast of a topic. And every time I prepare parts of it, I find myself just going down different rabbit holes, trying to find the original makor for different things. And it just takes so much longer than I anticipate things taking. But regardless, tonight, what I want to try to figure out a little bit more is the where of Shemitah. And what I mean by that is really, this is a broader Zeraim conversation, a broader conversation about the laws, right? We're in Seder Zeraim right now in Mishnah Yomi, right? The first Seder of the 6 Sedarim of Mishnayos. The reality is that we only have Masechet Brachos is the only Masechet in all of Zeraim that has a Gemara. So we don't have much of the extended rabbinic conversation in the topic of Zeraim. And so it leaves a couple of things with question marks, and especially because historically, right, the Jews, when they were in Bavel, there were Jews in Israel, but the Babylonian Jews were already in exile, were not going to be going back to Eretz Yisrael anytime soon. So you had many years where there weren't that many people talking about Hilchos Zeraim, which a lot of things depended upon the land of Israel. And it takes, right, basically the entire time of the Rishonim, you have a handful of Rishonim who might dabble in Israel. But for the most part, there's never really a solid living condition place for people to stay in Israel. So we have maybe a couple of people here and there, but we don't have many scholars who are producing works that are dealing with the laws of Eretz Yisrael during the entire Rishonim. So you have from the Gemara, from the Bavli, at least the Yerushalmi does deal with some of this stuff, but from the Bavli all the way through the time of the Rishonim. So that's from the year 200, right, from the Mishnah all the way until probably the year, right, like the end of the 15th century. There are no Jews living in Israel that are, right, established halachic authorities that we have people dealing with the laws of Eretz Yisrael. And that's, when you think about that, that's pretty crazy. And what happens is after the expulsion from Spain in 1492, there is a large group of Jews. I will say the one exception, we'll see the one exception today is the Rambam, because the Rambam deals with all sorts of topics, even topics that we know he knows no one's going to deal with, right? He talks about the Beit HaMikdash. He talks about all topics. So the Rambam is the one exception to this rule. And so he becomes particularly important in this realm. But with the exception of the Rambam, you don't really have major conversations about this topic until a bunch of rabbis end up creating a hub in both Yerushalayim and Tzfat in the late Rishonim, early Achronim stage and period. And that's when some of the conversations really heat up about this topic. But we'll probably do that last part outside. But the big question that I want to kind of pose to the group is we all understand that if you have Jewish-owned land in Eretz Yisrael, that is going to be subject to the fruit on that land is going to be subject to the laws of Shmita. But even that statement is confusing, right? I was talking to my son today on the car ride to CTA. So I was telling him, he was asking me what I had been learning about, because he saw me working on this over the weekend. And so I started talking to him about Shmita and how it works. And I said to him, if I were to ask you, how do we know what Eretz Yisrael is, what would you say? And he's like, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? I was like, well, if I was going to ask you, how would you define the land of Israel? What would you say? So he said, where Jews live. I said, well, we're Jews. We live here. Does that mean that our house is on Israel's property? It's like, no. This is so far away from Israel. That's not what I mean. I mean, where people in Israel live. That's Israel. I said, okay, but how do you make the board? Like, how do you decide where the edge is and what isn't? So he's like, okay, I'm thinking about it, trying to figure it out. And the truth is, I can think of, I think, 4 possibilities, 3 of which end up becoming some halachic possibilities. But I'm curious if anyone here wants to throw out, like, what if you were going to define Eretz Yisrael in a way that, right, would apply to the laws of Shmitta, how would you define what it means to be in Eretz Yisrael?
Well, I would look to where the borders were defined. Now, of course, we have various borders at different stages of time. And so I suppose I would look at the original, covenant, the gift, that God said, okay, this, and that, and it will be bounded in this area, which still is vague because there's still difference of opinions there. But I guess I would go back to that original
To Abraham.
territory. Yeah.
Right. The promise to Abraham is a very natural place to think about, right? What is the greater Israel? And the truth is that if that was the case, then Israel is quite large, right? Meaning it's a much larger area than any other version of Israel in our heads. I mean, it would push pretty far east compared to what we normally assume is Israel. So that's, I think, definitely a great place to start thinking about this. Any other possibilities? Okay, so another stage is when the Jews leave Egypt, right? So they enter into Eretz Yisrael and they conquer Eretz Yisrael. They conquer the areas that they're going to live. Now, we know from the book of Yehoshua, they don't conquer everything, right? And there are some things that don't quite get conquered, and it's a little bit messy. It's not totally clean. But the way the Gemara refers to that is Olei Mitzrayim, right? Those who went to Eretz Yisrael from Egypt, and it's known as Kedusha Rishona, right? The first time that the land of Israel was imbued with holiness by the fact that the Jewish people were on their homeland. And the way that the Gemara, and we'll see in the Rambam, we're not going to go back to the original Gemaras on this one, but we'll look at the Rambam. The way that the Gemara seems to conclude is that Kedusha Rishona was Kadsha L'Shaita, V'lo Kadsha L'Atid Lavo, right? That the original holiness of the land of Israel from the Olei Mitzrayim, from those who came to Israel from Egypt, was temporary. And that when the Jews were kicked out of the land, first time around, by the Babylonians, so that exile was basically undid the Kedusha of Eretz Yisrael, with the exception of Yerushalayim and particularly the Makom HaMikdash, the place where the Beit HaMikdash stood. That the holiness was the same, and that maintained itself, but everything else in Israel kind of was undone. Then we have the first exile, and then the Jews come back, and you have the second Beit HaMikdash, and that is built by Ezra and the Olim who come back, right? And the second Aliyah is, again, Kedusha Shniya, and the Gemara points out that the difference between Kedusha Rishona and Kedusha Shniya, the Kedusha that was imbued from the wars of Yehoshua versus Ezra, was that Ezra didn't fight wars to take Israel. Ezra got permission from the government and went to Israel. And there was a Kedusha of what the Gemara calls a chazaka, of taking ownership. Also, Yehoshua's Kedusha starts from the periphery and moves inside, right? The Kedusha starts from the outside, Aver HaYarden, and then pushes its way into Israel. As where the Kedusha of Ezra, the way that some describe it, is that the Kedusha of Ezra is they go back to Yerushalayim, they build up Yerushalayim, and then from there, they spread the Kedusha of Yerushalayim to the rest of Eretz Yisrael. Now, in descending order, right, the promise to Abraham is the largest area, Ole Mitzrayim is the middle, and then Ole Bavel is the smallest, right, in terms of area of what the state of Israel halachically looks like. Now, the last possibility, and this one has not yet, I haven't seen any poskim really take this one on as a real possibility, is that it's whatever we call Eretz Yisrael today, right? That as long as it's part of the Eretz Yisrael of today, that Eretz Yisrael of today should be the confines of what we call Israel. That is normally not how poskim. They normally paskin Kedusha Shnia, the Kedusha of Ezra. That when Ezra went back, that part of Eretz Yisrael is defined as Eretz Yisrael. Now, what I want to show is that this whole conversation gets still more complicated a little bit by the definition even during these time periods of how these things took place. So I'll give you an example when we get to Surya or Ramzova, but we'll get there in a second. So I'm going to share the screen now, and we're going to do a couple of Rambams. So Rambam Hilchos Shmita v'Yovel, the 4th chapter. We're starting from Halacha Chaf Hey, Halacha 25. Ein Shvius noheges ella be'eretz Yisrael bilvad. So Shmita only applies in Israel. Shneimar ki savo ela aretz. Right, when you come to the land, right? So when you come to the land, then Shmita applies. When you're not in the land, Shmita does not apply, right? So if I have a little patch of grass in my backyard that I plant things in, I don't have to worry about the 7th year being a Shmita year. The produce that's produced is not Shmita produce. It's all irrelevant to me. V'noheges bein bifnei habayis, bein shelo bifnei habayis, and Shmita is not dependent upon the Beit HaMikdash. Shmita applies whether there's a Beit HaMikdash standing or not. Halacha chavav. Kol she'achziku bo ole bavel. Right, so all of the parts of Israel, and the language of chazaka here, right, hechziku bo, those who came made aliyah from Bavel. This is again with Ezra and Nehemiah. Ad kiziv asur ba'avoda. So you cannot, right, and this is the border. You cannot do any work there. V'chol hasvichen shitzomchim bo asur b'achila. And on a rabbinic level, the rabbis were worried when it came to vegetables, because vegetables require people to plant them really year after year, generally for them to grow properly. They were afraid that people might try to sneak and plant vegetables and say, whoa, look at this, amazing, a miracle happened. All my vegetables somehow were just like, they just grew again. It's just like, it's an amazing miracle. So the rabbi said, on a rabbinic level, you can't eat the things that grow that are vegetables, okay? We're not worried about fruit because they come back every single year without you doing anything. So the rabbis were not worried about fruit. They were worried specifically about vegetables. So you have an Isser of Svichen, that there's a rabbinic injunction against eating vegetables that grow on your property. V'chol shelo hechziku bo ela ole Mitzrayim bilvad. Shehu michaziv va'ad nahar va'ad amana, right? So you have certain areas of Eretz Yisrael that the Oli Mitzrayim, right? They conquered, but Ezra and the Oli Bavel did not, right? So for instance, Ever Hayardain, or the Deep South, right? South of the Negev, south of the Dead Sea. These are areas, and then as you go closer to Eilat, you'll get to an area where neither Ole Mitzrayim or Ole Bavel conquered, right? So you have different durations, right? And depending on your map, you would kind of have a shrinking or growing Israel size. Again, Ezra's is the smallest, Ole Mitzrayim is the middle, and the promise to Avram is the largest. The Afal Pisha who Asr Ba'avodah B'Shvius. So even though these areas that were made holy by the Egyptians, by the Egyptian Olim, right, are still not supposed to be worked, right? So there's still the biblical injunctions were going to be machmir, because we'll call it a suffix deoraita l'chumra, right? On a biblical question, we're going to be strict. Hasvichin shetzomchim bo, right? The growths that grow in that area, in that gray area, mutar b'achila. You can eat them because the rabbis, again, the iser svichin, the prohibition of eating vegetables was a rabbinic injunction added on. So there, we're not going to be strict on the areas that were only part of Israel for those who came up from Egypt, but not so for those who came up from Babel. And right, so from beyond the river, or again, Amana is to the south, so beyond this section of the south, beyond the desert in the south of Egypt, of Israel, right, when you get to the near Eilat, so there, says the Rambam, not only is it can you eat the vegetables that grow there, but you can work the land. It's not part of Israel in any version. So this is what I mean by it gets a little bit more complicated, because there's what the Rambam seems to say that there's gray areas, right? Areas that were only made holy the first time around when it was a temporary kedusha. We still enforce certain biblical injunctions about working that area. Similarly, this is Surya. We have this other concept. So Surya, around Zova, if you looked in, I believe it's Shmuel Bet. I think it's towards the beginning. I think it's like Parak Gimel, something like that. So the story there is that David HaMelech goes and defeats the Plishtim and defeats some other areas. So he takes Gaza and he takes some other areas, right? And these areas are known as Surya, and kind of the surrounding areas where the conquering was not done by the whole Jewish people. It was done by an individual, right? The David HaMelech did this by himself, basically without an army. It was a time when he was on the run, and it was not a nation conquering; it was an individual conquering, right? So Afal Pisha Ein Shvius Noheges Bo Minatora. Again, since Shmita still is not going to apply in these areas biblically, still we have a rabbinic injunction that you can't do the biblical prohibition. So you can't work the land on a rabbinic level here, because it's really a biblical idea. Because we're afraid otherwise people might say, you know what, why live in Eretz Yisrael? I can't work my land in the 70 years. You know what I'll do? I'll just move to these areas that are basically Eretz Yisrael, but they're just outside of it. And then what you'll find is that people are going to be really excited about living just outside of Israel. And so the rabbis wanted to prevent that. So they made these lands also prohibited to work. Aval Ammon, Moav, Mitzrayim, Vishinar. But if you go beyond that, you go to the lands of Ammon, Moav, right? So these are to the southeast, or to the southwest, right, or Bavel, right? Even though even these areas, and this kind of is going back to that third option, right? The original Greater Israel type of notion, that maybe even these areas were part of the original promise, and so therefore rabbinically we still say that you're chayav in truma and meiser, right? That you have to separate certain fruits and vegetables, which we do not do in America. Ein shvias noheges bahen, still Shmita does not apply. Aver HaYarden, again, the other side of the Jordan River was modern day Transjordan, right? So you have shvias noheges ba midivrayim, again, Shmita applies rabbinically. Usviche Surya ve'Aver HaYarden mutar b'achila, but again, because they're only rabbinic, the rabbinic injunction that in Israel that vegetables that grow you can't eat does not apply. Lo yiyu artzos elu chamurin me'eretz Yisrael shechziku ba'olei Mitzrayim, and none of these areas are going to be stricter than the areas that the first Aliyah from Egypt that were not then resettled in the time of Ezra, right? So those rules are going to be more strict for that than for Aver HaYarden and or Surya, which are less good candidates for being part of what we would call Eretz Yisrael. The Ravid says Evar Yarden Shvias no Hagesbo, right? The Ravid actually says no. That on the other side of the Jordan, in fact, you should keep Shmita. Fine. Oh no, sorry. The Ravid is quoting the Rambam here. I made that mistake. Sorry about that. Right, so he's quoting the Rambam here that it's right. So here he says it's midivrayim. So it is only the Rabbanan. So the Ravid says you don't even have to say that, right? Yeah, Amar Avram. Why do you have to bring this up, right? Mikal v'chomer. It's you can infer it. Because the Ezra never took the Evar Yarden, so it is the same status as every other section that you just talked about. Excuse me, that was not taken by the second Aliyah of Ezra and his people, but was conquered by Yehoshua and his people. So the Evar Yarden, the entire Evar Yarden, is exactly the same status as that. So why specify Evar Yarden versus anything else? Okay, fine. Sorry about that. Okay, so this last one is kind of where I want to spend a little bit of more time, just fleshing out kind of how some of the debates play out. So the Rambam then says, Akum, so Obe Kochavu Mazalos, a idol worshiper, Shekana Karka Eretz Yisrael, who buys land, excuse me, in Israel, Vizara Bishvias, and he plants on the Shemitah year, Peosea Mutarin, you are allowed to partake of those fruit, and you do not have to worry about Shmita. Shalo gazru al spichen ella mipnei over avera, because we said that the whole concept, the whole rabbinic idea of spichen, which is again that vegetables cannot be eaten even if they grow by themselves in a Jewish person's field, because we're worried that people are going to be sneakily planting their vegetables and saying, miracles happen. My vegetables just grew by themselves. So in order to avoid that, we say, no. You can't even eat them if they grow by themselves. So that's only going to be true for Jews, right? For non-Jews who don't have the whole concept of Shmita, so there's not going to be any Isser D'Rabbanan of Spichen on their produce. So therefore, their produce will be allowed to be eaten. Now, what's not clear though is whether or not the peros, the fruit that grow on a non-Jewish person's land, do those fruit have kedushas shvius or not? Do they have on them the status of being holy, right? That they have to, right? So again, peros shvius, fruit or vegetables that have the holiness of Shemitah can be eaten, obviously, right? We eat those things, but you can't waste them. They, right? Any of the remains have to go into what we call a pach Shemitah. You have to put it into a special garbage can that's going to let it rot before you throw it away, because it can get destroyed by itself, but you can't destroy it. So you have to, again, do certain things that are unique with the fruit of Shemitah. Additionally, we noted, I think, in a previous iteration of talking about Shemitah, that there's a view of the Ramban, Nachmanides, who says that eating peros shvius is a mitzvah. It's actually a big debate between the Ramban, who says it is, and the Rambam, who doesn't list it as a mitzvah. But so maybe it's a mitzvah to eat peros shvius. There's special things you have to do with peros shvius, but you're allowed to eat peros shvius in general. Again, barring the concept of svicha and other isurim that sometimes prevent you from being able to eat them. You also can't do schora with peros shvius. You can't buy or sell, right? So it gets into some crazy stuff. How do you then get it from one person to the next? So again, maybe another time we'll talk about otzar based in and some other things that they do to try to get around some of these rules. But long story short, the Rambam says that you can eat right, that if a non-Jew, if a akum, right, has land in Israel and plants on it on Shemitah, the peros are mutarim. Sounds like there's no shvius, no Shemitah on this produce. So where does this come from? This concept that a non-Jew, when he buys the land, all of a sudden magically there's no Shmita on that produce. How does that work? So the Mefarshim point to a Gemara in Gittin. The Gemara in Gittin, Mem Zayin and Aleph 47a, is a Mishnah followed by a Gemara. It's about whether it's really, again, and this is the amazing thing about all these topics, is that it's not about Shemitah, right? The Gemara is about Trumos and Maestros. But again, we borrow from one of these topics, the other one of these topics, a lot. And it's very interesting trying to kind of trace where these things come from. So the Gemara there talks about if a person sells their field to a idol worshiper, maybe mimanu bikurim. So the rabbi has made a rule that you have to then buy the first fruit from the land that you sold from the non-Jew, and they'll bring them to Jerusalem for bikurim. Why they make you do this? Because they really didn't want you to sell the land in the first place. And they figure if they're going to make you do this really annoying thing of after you sold your field, you have to still buy stuff from the non-Jew in order to bring it to Yerushalayim, that will greatly discourage you from selling it in the first place. And once you sold it, it might encourage you to buy it back. And so for that reason, they made this rule. So Amar Rabba says in the Gemara, and this is the debate between Rabba and Rabbi Elazar, I think, so that they have parallel opposite views. Okay, so Rabba says, even though the idol worshippers, when they acquire the land, they don't have the power to uproot the requirement to bring meiser. In other words, if you buy produce of a non-Jew in Israel, you still have to take off meiser from that produce yourself. Okay, so the requirement for meiser continues on the produce of Eretz Yisrael, even if it was grown on the land of a non-Jew. Shnamar, bechi li haaretz. Ki li haaretz, because for me is the land. Li kedusha haaretz. Right. So for me is the kedusha of the land, meaning for Hashem. So it's not about who owns it. It's not about you or me. It's not about the human who owns the land. The land belongs to God. So the Truma and Meiser is held. You have to do it even if it's owned by non-Jew. But even though they can't undo the kedusha of Truma Meiser, he says they can own the land and do what they want with it, right? They can dig ditches and other things on their land. Shneimar, okay, that's why this is confusing to me. This bet probably has a reference to something in the Gimel as well. Hashemayim shemayim Hashem ba'aretz and some livnei Adam, right? That the heaven was given to Hashem and the land was given to people. In other words, that here we're saying, so the non-Jews have the ability to use their land as they see fit. And Rabbi Elazar says the exact opposite, right? That that actually, if you buy produce from a non-Jew in Israel, you don't have to bring meiser. That's the view of Rabbi Elazar, right? So he says the opposite is true by lachbor bobar shitamaros. There the non-Jew is not allowed to. So, long story short, the debate about yesh kinyan lafkia by truma, or here by meiser rather. So the question is, it seems like the Rambam is saying that because the non-Jew owns this, there's no Shmita. In other words, yesh kinyan akum lafkia midei shvius, that the ownership of the non-Jew is able to uproot the reality of the peiros, the fruit that's on the land, of being Shmita produce. Now this, as I mentioned at the beginning of our shir, was a major debate between the Mabit and the Rav Yosef Cairo, both in Tzvat. And as I mentioned, after 1492, there was a lot of Jews who made their way to Tzvat and Yerushalayim. And in Tzvat, you had a number of great rabbis. And the Mabit was right, as I did Trani, and Rav Yosef Cairo, the author of the Beis Yosef Shulchan Aruch, no slouches, two titans of Halacha. And they had a big machlokas. And the Mabit was of the opinion that the Akum, the Kinyan Akum, the non-Jewish ownership of the land of Israel had no impact on the status of the produce as Shmita produce. That the produce continued to be the produce continued to be Shmita produce, and the Chazon Ish followed that view. Significantly later, the Chazon Ish was a very important posek in the realm of Shmita in the last 100 years, and he followed the view of the Mabit. But Rav Yosef Cairo disagreed. Rav Yosef Cairo believed that the kinyan of a non-Jew, in fact, did uproot the holiness of Shmita from the produce. And by the way, we're not talking about the Heter Mechira right now, right? The Heter Mechira is a very important topic for another time, which is the notion that we can sell the land of Israel to a non-Jew and then buy the produce from them. The whole concept is based off of the assumption that selling the produce to a non-Jew and then them, right, making the produce, that it's no longer produce of Shemitah, right? If that's not true, then that undermines the very basic right, notion of the entire kula. So you have to assume Shulchan Aruch for the Heter Mechira to work. But regardless, this again became a big debate between Rav Kook and the Chazon Ish in the most recent iteration of the debate, 100 years, whatever, less than 100 years ago, that 50 years ago, that they debated whether or not the ownership of a non-Jew would impact Shmita. So let's take a step back for a second and just, again, when you find yourself in Kroger and you see that something is the produce of Eretz Yisrael, so again, if it's a Shemitah year and it's a vegetable, you should probably stay away from it, right? Like the peppers in Kroger. But the reality is that for all we know, those peppers may have been produced in southern Israel, near Eilat, which technically is produce of Israel, but is not produce of Shemitah, right? Technically, we don't know. It's, and this is part of the challenge of, right, what really is, what really isn't. Like, how do we really keep track of all these things? And it becomes a game a little bit of big numbers, and how do you assume chazaka, rov, things. It becomes a little bit of a mess. And right, in addition to maybe it's from an area that's under dispute. Maybe it's an area that's only rabbinic in terms of its prohibition. And so, right, maybe if that's true, then there's not going to be any Isser Svichen and any other things. It might mitigate some of the issues. So when you think about it, knowing what product you're talking about, and therefore knowing which season it's going to be a problem versus which season it's not going to be a problem, only gives you half of your information that you really need. You also need to know, well, where the product really come from. I got that it came from Israel, but where in Israel? Because not all of Israel technically is Israel halachically. And so this really creates some interesting questions that I have yet to really give you clear guidance on. And it's because it's really confusing, and it's probably product by product and situation by situation that you have to establish certain baseline of facts before you can even begin to answer the question. And so my goal, as much as it was to confuse you, it was to try to highlight for you why these questions get so confusing, and why these questions become hard to necessarily give answers with complete clarity. So I hope that over the course of the last 3 classes, we've been able to do the following, and that is to lay the foundation for appreciating kind of what poskim have to deal with in terms of trying to come up with a rule of thumb, so to speak, right? When we go to the supermarket and find products that were from Eretz Yisrael in the year like this year and next year, depending on the product. And so, again, we dealt with the prohibition of exporting Perot Shvius. We dealt with the issue of, right, how each and every type of item has a different start date in terms of when it is branded as produce of Shemitah, vegetables versus fruit versus grains and legumes versus etrog, all of them having their own unique status. Then we spoke about tonight the issue of where the borders of Israel technically are and how that affects, right, the notion of Shemitah, part one, and part two is, does the ownership of a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael remove the whole concept of Shemitah from this produce, or does the status as produce of Shemitah continue through, even though it's owned by a non-Jew, but because the land of Israel belongs to Hashem, so to speak, that the laws of Shemitah will apply even to the produce of a non-Jew, like Meiser. I will stop here for thoughts, questions, but I hope this was a little bit helpful for making it clear why it's confusing. But the reality is that we'll see. I still might do one more share focused on some really practical stuff, but I might move on from Shemitah depending on how burnt out I am and how hard it will be for me to keep on going with the Shemitah. It's been one of the hardest things that for me to prepare. I'm not sure why it's been so hard to prepare Shemitah, but I just haven't had an easy time doing it. So I might shift to something else for a little bit. Maybe we'll come back to it again. But this is the second time I've dabbled in Shemitah, and both times it's been an uphill battle.
One point I found interesting when you're talking about what area is Israel, that that with the first exile, that the holiness only stayed within Yerushalayim and the Mount. So then when Ezra came back, it spread from there, it grew from there, from that area out. So that gives a sense of a, I don't know, more of a permanence continuity, radiating around Jerusalem.
Exactly, and I think that's how the Rambam and others, not here but elsewhere, that's kind of how they talk about it. They talk about it as the Kedusha of Yerushalayim being forever, and the Kedusha of Ezra was really in many ways taking the Kedusha of Yerushalayim and spreading it out.
But the Kedusha of Yerushalayim had to be initially applied through the conquest.
Yep.
Or through the taking possession of the land. So.
Yep.
Okay. So I certainly wouldn't try to poskin anything myself.
Yeah, and unfortunately, my view at this point is like to err on the side of caution if you can, and unless we could get more information, it's hard to know otherwise. But still, with certain things, I think again you can figure out, right, that there are right time frames that we think, oh, it's Shemitah year, so it's a problem, but really it's not, right? Meaning fruit probably until maybe a month ago or so, right? Even though the Shemitah year started at Rosh Hashanah, unlikely it's going to be problematic, right? Almost all of that fruit that if you found fruit that said product of Israel for the last couple of months, most likely that stuff is totally fine. On the flip side, if you find fruit at the beginning of next year, right, it's very possible that's going to be problematic still. So that's the type of stuff that should be helpful as a rule of thumb, but is always challenging. Monica, do you have I saw you kind of go off mute a couple times for a second.
Yeah, I have a tangential question.
Sure.
What's the status of hydroponic vegetables? They do not touch the land.
Yes. So when I was in YU, I was privileged to go with a coalition of YU students with Rabbi Tzvi Sobolovsky to Eretz Yisrael during a Shemitah year, and we learned about Hilchos Shemitah. Some of my earlier versions of this of doing Shemitah, I used some of the Makoros, some of the sources that we did with that I did with Rabbi Sobolovsky. This time was more just going back to the basics and doing Mishnayos. But on that trip, we met with a whole bunch of farmers And some of the farmers were hydroponic farmers. And in Israel, it's called motzim minutak, right? That they draw, but it's separated. Minutak is it's separate from the land, right? So they don't draw directly from the land. They create these. They have no dirt. It's like this funny looking like stuff that I don't know. It's almost like this reddish material that they plant the seeds in, but they don't. It doesn't. There's no dirt, and it's kind of off the ground completely. And there's separation between the ground and these things. And I know that some hashkachot in Eretz Yisrael will give a hashkacha. They'll basically use motzei minutak as a snif lahakel, which means, right, that let's say you have produce that's made right in the southern part of Israel, south of the Dead Sea, right, but the part that's still perhaps Ole Mitzrayim, but not Ole Bavel, right, not quite the Eilat section, but the that middle section. So you might have people who say, right, will say that it's from the I think it's the Arava or Aruba, and then it will also say motzei minutak. That they'll do a combination. They'll do a section of Israel that has less problematic, and they'll also have motzei minutak, and because of that, they'll give a hashkacha that it's totally fine. You don't have to worry about Shmitta, right? And so what often happens is that it's normally not relied upon by itself, but it's used in tandem with a secondary component to basically allow parish fees. There are some post-game who straight up allow it, but and the truth is more and more it's becoming like it used to be that they couldn't produce that much. Right now they've really perfected the art more and more that they can really produce an incredible amount of things without soil. I mean, I know that the 80-acre stuff that we have is these vertical farms that are now exist, which the ability for us to do certain things now is quite fascinating. But it's a great question. It honestly could be a couple of shiurim by itself. Just going through what hydroponics are and how it works, it's pretty cool. But yeah, it's a great question, and sometimes you will see on the hashkachot in Israel, it's a mess. It's a mess when it's always a mess, right? Trying to figure out hashkachos in Israel, but during Shmita year, it's the worst. It's worse than Pesach, right? Right? So you have that, but then at Shmita year you have all these other layers, and you'll see sometimes motzei minutak. So what that means is that it's hydroponics. And so if you see hashkacha that says that, they're relying on that kula. Sometimes they'll have that plus, right, a certain area or whatever it is. But that's generally, I think, how it's used.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Right, thank
and
you.
We'll see. Maybe one more week of Shmita, but we'll see. Maybe we'll start something else next week.
Okay.
All right.
Good
Very well.
night.
Thank you. Night.
Okay, good night.